Number 2 Belmont Terrace, a short-life property, was leased to Chiswick Women's Aid by Hounslow Council as a community centre for women. ERIN Pizzey, who started the centre, had originally seen it just as a place where women could come to sit and chat.
It was at that time when this woman came in and just took her jersey off and showed us these appalling bruises, and her breasts were just like sort of bowls of blue jelly, and said that her husband had beaten her very badly, and no one would help her. As the word spread locally, women started to come in. They just came to the doorstep with their children and said, "Please let me in, no one will help." And began to build up this dossier of terrible, relentless uncaring on the part of all the services in the country. Nobody seemed to be doing anything constructive to help. They just seemed to be sending these women back to the men who beat them, and some back to be killed. When a woman gets to Chiswick and she comes through that door and she bursts into tears, and she feels she's safe, then her violent husband, if she's made the decision not to go back, really becomes irrelevant, because you're left then with a very badly damaged woman.
Within a matter of months, the first woman came in. She took off her jersey and she was blue from her neck down to her waist. He'd beaten her with a chair leg. And I took her in. And that night, I couldn't leave her in that house on her own, so I took her home. And it's no surprise now, but I was surprised. Within a matter of hours, as I tucked her up in bed with her bruises, in the top bunk of my son's bunk bed, there was big pounding on the door. At this point, my husband had come back from work. He said, "What happened today?" I said, "Oh, well, nothing, but there is a woman upstairs who's..." And the problem was, as I opened the door, because of this big pounding on it, there was Wally, her husband, going, "I am not a violent man," smashing his fist into his hand. And my husband disappeared very quickly upstairs. And I said, "Wally, you've really beaten her badly. She's sleeping. But I know she's telephoned you, because there's no way you'd be here if she hadn't." And that was my first introduction to a wife battering. And I was faced with two immediate problems, but I was an expert in one section. I was an expert because my mother was extremely violent. Now, my father was also dysfunctional and violent, but he did not have a personality disorder. He held down a job. He was a diplomat. He had a raging temper. He was a shocking bully and a very frightening man. But he did not have a personality disorder. My mother was completely different. She was violent, she was manipulative, she was beautiful, she was cold, and she lived in this total solipsistic world of her own, and she was dangerous to us, particularly to me, because I looked like my father. So therefore, I was the one that was beaten regularly. So when I opened the Refuge, I opened it on an understanding that this was not a gender issue.
The open door policy of Chiswick Women's Aid meant that on average some 40 women and children were staying in the 4-roomed house at any one time.
The most vital moment is when she comes through that door, and she must then feel, as people move towards her, that these are people who are going to be with her, stay with her, until she's finally resolved herself.
Do you have a drink?
In the very beginning, I think I was very frightened of the violence of the men. And slowly, and this is why we didn't have men coming in, but slowly I realized, as the men did turn up and weren't violent towards us, but in fact they had their needs as well and could be controlled and helped not to act violently in our house. And also I saw the need for the children to have good, gentle men around.
Erin, I am so happy to have this opportunity to connect with you, even though I'm sorry it isn't in person. We've both been involved with women's and men's and gender issues for about a half a century. And what we did that is so similar, that makes me so appreciate you, is we saw something different than the ideology that was being presented to us of a women oppressed, men oppressor. You saw that domestic violence was a two-way street, that it was almost always reciprocal. And therefore you sort of sense that you needed to work with both sexes to end this domestic violence. I started seeing the exact same thing, that not only was domestic violence about equal, but that both sexes had their form of privilege and both sexes had their form of manipulation. And we both sort of always felt that this was not about a women's movement per se, but it was about a gender liberation movement, freeing sexes from the rigid roles of the past to more flexible roles for the future.
I think the very early learning experiences with the first few mothers who came in, who got out of one violent relationship and seemed to be settling, and then would go out and recreate a violent situation with a new man and would come back bruised, began to make me realize that for some percentage of women, certainly not all of our women, I would say a third, where they were coming from violent homes themselves, they were attracted towards violence. Their pleasure and their pain seemed to be getting very confused. And at the time when she was being beaten, in fact, she was satisfying a need in herself, although it hurt very badly afterwards. And she would look and seek for more violence. And that was a very big learning experience, because I had completely rejected the provocation theory, partly because I was so frightened of the prejudice that existed within the society that actually tainted all women with the need to be beaten. Those battered children grow up to batter, that's what I learnt, whether it be a man or a woman. And I now know that if a woman comes in with a history of violence in her own childhood, the chances are she will be probably violent to her children, and she will want to live on this knife edge of crisis and danger. And she has to learn about herself and why she needs those forms of danger.
Well, thank you very much for coming this evening. I know a lot of you have come from near and far, and there is only one reason why we're here, and that is to celebrate the fantastic ERIN PIZZEY and the 50 years that she has spent campaigning and working to help all victims of domestic abuse. I'd not long started my PhD in domestic abuse, and my supervisor had nudged me to start looking outside of the feminist paradigm and introduced me to the notion that men could also be victims. And she started to mention a few names here and there, one of which was ERIN PIZZEY. So I did like a good student does, and I went out and I discovered the book that we should all read, if you already haven't, called This Way to the Revolution. Yeah. And it felt like someone had climbed inside my head and had told a story that belonged to me. I couldn't actually believe that this existed, and it showed a completely different direction to the domestic abuse industry that we have today. In that book, it told a story of a woman that wanted to belong to an industry and an organisation and a movement for all the right reasons, for all the reasons to show equality for everyone, but was shunned for telling the truth. So rather than sit back and do nothing and go away and lick her wounds, she stood up. And she stood up and did something extraordinary and opened the first ever shelter for victims of domestic abuse in the world. Not only did she do that for women, she did it for men also. And she listened, she asked the right questions. She was ahead of her time. This is a woman that actually knows the true meaning of the word equality. She doesn't care if you're a woman and a victim, or a man and a victim, or a child that is experiencing this on a 24/7 basis. She just wants to stop domestic abuse, and she wants to help victims and perpetrators of domestic abuse to live a better life. But the very organisation that was built on the shoulders of giants has not celebrated this extraordinary woman. It takes all of us renegade and vagabonds and rebels to come together and understand how important ERIN is. What I would like to do today is to start something as a legacy to the work that ERIN has done for the last 50 years. And I would like to present ERIN with the first ever ERIN PIZZEY Award for support for all victims of domestic abuse. There you go. I've got the box for you as well. Thank you. ERIN is the first recipient, quite absolutely necessary, but this is something that we endeavour to repeat every single year. And this isn't something that is just for male victims or female victims or LGBTQ victims. This is for everybody that's involved in the domestic abuse industry. We don't actually care if you have a feminist belief or an inclusive belief. If you've done something to help victims, you can be nominated for this award each and every year. But it is in absolute honour of ERIN PIZZEY and her 50 years of work. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to say thank you so much for all of you coming. It's a real surprise. I kept saying to Rick, who's going to buy tickets to come and see me? And he said he didn't know. Anyway, I'm very pleased to see you all, and I'm so thrilled with this present. The one lovely thing about now is that I know a lot of the mothers and the children who were in the refuge, and now the children have their own children. And it's such a uplifting, joyous moment when they are with good, loving, warm relationships, and their children are healthy and are growing up in harmony and in peace. And I can't ask for more than that. What you have to do is to create mentors for those children. And what saved me was Miss Williams in the children's holiday home that I went to. And she was the first woman that I ever respected. I wrote a book called Infernal Child, which actually I was an incredibly violent child, which is no surprise. But when I first met her and I had to stay in her house, she was 6'7". She was, and she was enormous, and she drove ambulances during the war, and she was a fantastic model. She never ever lifted her voice to any of the 40 children that were there. She'd just look at me when I was being obnoxious and say, well, Erin, I think you'll have to wash up. And when you're washing up for 40 kids, you don't do it very often. So thank you all for coming tonight. I feel very blessed.
I just wanted to say a few off-the-cuff words, Erin. I work for Families and Fathers. We have thousands of phone calls of people coming to our meetings every year. Most of them are men, and most of them are hurting. Some of them have been angels who have had a terrible time with their exes. Some of them have not been angels, and they all need help.
Yeah.
And what really struck me in the video, which was actually found something really inspirational, was that there you were in the thick of it with all those dozens of people in a crowded space, and with all of that going on, your message was, we need to bring the men in, the good men and the less good men, and they all need help, and the good men can inspire the others. And the comment you made also about the woman who provoked the good men to try to prove the point, it all kind of shows the complexity of the intergenerational violence, and how we need to work together, and we need men and women working together, because in isolation we're not going to find the solution.
I was speaking to a number of my colleagues who were around when we first formed, and they reminded me that you were the inspiration behind the organisation, and because of that inspiration we've continued to grow. We support thousands of men, not only directly through a helpline, but we've worked with police forces and councils and huge number of other organisations to set up services. You're our honorary patron, and we really value your support, not only in setting up the charity and being a pioneer, but also giving us such encouragement throughout the years, which has literally saved thousands and thousands of lives, not only women's lives but men's lives and their children too.
How did Denise, working partner here, and I come into delivering work with men and women that exhibit abusive behaviours? Well, 1994 in Northampton, there was a conference. A woman spoke to us, and she said, violent men are all the same and they won't change. And so, as a man at that time, I was absolutely incensed by the knowledge of that, and made up my mind there and then that we would do something about that. Thank you very much indeed, Erin. From about 2004, you were our inspiration to carry on working with both men and women in mixed gender groups.
Well done.
The difficulty, of course, is that they didn't want to hear the message which we've delivered with 1,100 men and more than 120 women over the last 26 years.
This honouring of you is so overdue.
You are a woman of incredible integrity. You bleed compassion.
When we started on the journey of looking at parental alienation, where I felt like I'd stepped on a societal landmine, you came to me within 24 hours. I got your number, and I don't know if you remember, but you spent an hour and a half on the phone with me. And I was blown away that this legend would spend time with me, didn't even know who I was. You are amazing. And the truth, there's a great quote, lies have speed, but truth has endurance. And your truth has endured and is coming to the fore. And everyone in this room is right behind you to make sure that your legacy is continued. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being such a wonderful woman.
The only analogy I can draw to that, coming from South Africa, is two people, Martin Luther King and, of course, Mandela. And I draw that analogy to the domestic abuse side, someone who's brave enough to speak up for what needs to be said globally so that we can put a stop to the cycle of transgenerational abuse, and your bravery in order to speak out loudly for something that's so important in order to change things for future generations. I thank you and I applaud you. Thank you very much.
Erin, opening the very first shelter for abused people, some 50 years ago, just an amazing accomplishment on pennies and prayers, really, when everybody put you down for even doing such a thing. And then recognizing that men can also be victims as well at the same time, and prone to violence and your other work, just an amazing achievement. And I want to say that I think that there's a lot of progress being made. Sometimes we think that, oh my goodness, we can't fight the radical feminist agenda that wants money and power and control, really, as opposed to helping people. But look what's happened since then. Now there are many shelters. Well, quite a few, Mankind Project in UK, all these other interested organizations and people that are spreading the reality of the situation. And all of that really is a result of your work that you started so long ago. I agree with Margaret Mead. There's no doubt that what a small group of dedicated people to change the world can do is the only thing that ever has and ever will. And, you know, you started that, Erin. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I mean, it's just phenomenal. It really is. And all this support that's, I know Mum gives you so much, but everyone's giving so much back. It really is. It's just so moving. And I work in children and families, and I come up against refugees all the time, and it is so frustrating. And in fact, we had someone about a year ago, they've set up in where I work for men, for perpetrators to attend. And she gave a very good spiel to sort of start it off, and she said, you know, even if the man doesn't recognise his violence, we will still work with them. And I thought, great, fantastic, because DBIP won't work with men who won't say they're violent. Brilliant. And then you said, of course, we do have to remember that it is only men that are violent. It is never the women that are violent. They are only violent if they have to defend themselves. And your heart just sinks. So just thank you all for being here. Thank you for supporting my mum, and I know that she gives you so much back. We do have to keep going, and we've got to change it. And it just breaks my heart when I hear this, that it's still going on the way it is today. So thank you.
I did experience domestic violence as a child. I know what it's like, and I relate to exactly what you're talking about. And I think what my mum wanted you to know, it wasn't just the refuges that had an impact, it was the fact that women knew there was an option. And that actually they didn't have to stay with that, there was somewhere else to go. And I think you kind of got a revolution of women being able to get out of their situations and being able to think in a different way.
I was coming here tonight, I spoke to quite a few people saying I was coming to a dinner to honour you, and particularly I suppose, women of a certain age said to me, tell Erin, we remember them. And the impact on the lives of people like me and others, and the inspiration really of taking the really tough road, but the right road. And I think what you've done is probably flower so many activists, so many people fighting for the right cause, and we're making progress. In Welsh we say diolch yn fawr, which is thank you very much.
Thank you.
In 1970s in Ireland, my parents, being a bit rebellious, used to buy English newspapers, heavily frowned upon, and we were reading about the Refuge in Chiswick. Many years later, I came across her again. I asked her to meet her. And within a few minutes I realised, if I'm a very lucky man and shut up, I can learn an awful lot in a short space of time here. A number of years later, after my various successes and defeats and all the rest, and living by a wing and a prayer, I asked her to write a foreword to my book. I actually cried when I read the foreword she wrote. Because nobody in this world had the power, the knowledge and the insight to write what she wrote.
I was about 11 and we all turned off from Liverpool. My mum, 2 sisters and me and my brother. Years later, I found out that Erin bought a ticket for me to go back to Liverpool to see my dad, because I was from Liverpool. Must have been in touch with my father somewhere or my mother. So I got home with my dad, and I did love my dad. I didn't want to be in London, I didn't want to be in Chiswick, and I didn't know where I was. No one could understand me, because, you know, and I remember us all being in there, and it was great. We got a break, that's what we did. We got a break from the chaoticness in our lives.
So Erin, I so want you to know that there are hundreds of days in each year that I think about you and am strengthened by your courage to be the person that I know will be seen in the long run as someone who's contributed so much to our culture and our lifetime. Thank you, Erin.
Just listening to everything and understanding my grandma's journey, and that she did the right thing when it wasn't popular, when people didn't understand it. And I was born in 1979, and I witnessed Grandma going through the wilderness. of her beliefs. Having that kind of bias, it doesn't help women or men. But I just want to say that I'm so amazed to see this happening for your grandma. That's all I wanted to say, is that it's not been easy.